But it sounds like there's
I just don't think they're taking the intern seriously.
There are, this is already live, you can actually, when it turns on, it's live, it's recording. Here right now. It's hearing us.
Call the meeting to order. Ms. Dahl, you call the roll.
Scott Osbrook,
Here.
Lawrence Bingham, Chris Colclater, Bill Watts,
Here.
Paul Goddess,
Here.
Bruce Mullins,
Here.
Richard McMullen,
Here.
Doug Melton, Rusty Moss,
Here.
Robert Reynolds,
Here.
Richard Rover,
Here.
David Vandergrift,
Here.
Les Ward. We have a quorum.
Thank you. You have in front of you the minutes from our last meeting in April. You can get a motion for approval. Motion. Second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Thank you.
Who was the first?
Ms.
Okay,
Dahl.
Paul. Thank you.
Before we jump into the department reports, I just want to say it's good to see everybody. It's nice to be back. So we'll make the most of it. And moving on now to the director's report. Sweet.
Good morning. Can y'all hear me? Or I don't know. Okay. Good morning. My name is Julie Link. I am the Chief Administrator for the Environment for the state of Arkansas. And I'm here today on behalf of Secretary Keogh. And she sends her regards. We're really glad to get to see everyone in person again. And we're very excited today to really, I guess we could call it an air show we're going to have for you all. But for the moments that we have in the director's report on the agenda, I would like to bring our air staff up. You're going to hear that the state of the air, which we have some just absolutely fantastic news to report to you all. But I thought it was important for us to take a moment to recognize the staff and the faces and places that they've gone behind all of this. So with your indulgence, Mr. Chair, I would like to introduce the heads of our air department, affectionately known around here as our airheads. So with that, Will Montgomery, could you come up? Will Montgomery serves as our Associate Director of Air. And with that, Will, I'd like you to tell the commission and our audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure, it's good to see you all again. I'm William Montgomery. I'm the Associate Director of the Office of Air Quality. I grew up here in Little Rock, and I have a degree from Rhodes College and a JD here in Little Rock, and I am a licensed attorney. So I've worked here since 2015, and I'm the Associate Director of the Office of Air Quality. I look forward to giving you the State of the Air presentation in a few moments. Good to see you all.
And next, I would like to introduce to Tricia Treese.
Good morning. I'm the Deputy Associate Director for the Office of Air Quality. I have a master's in biology. I've been with the department since 2013 in the planning group, and I continue to manage that group. And we're the folks that are responsible for coming up with all the strategies for ensuring that we continue to have clean air in the state.
And next, I would like to introduce to you one of our technical experts here, Tom Rayoon.
Good morning. My name is Tom Rayoon. I'm not from Arkansas, obviously, with those first three words. You can figure that out. I grew up in Massachusetts, Waltham is kind of around Lexington, Concord, if you know that. And I am the Senior Operations Manager, which is over the air permits and compliance branch. Been here 23 years in the Office of Air Quality. And I think that was everything on the list. So, thank you.
And last but not least, I'd like to introduce to you Demetria Kimbrough.
Good morning. My name is Demetria Kimbrough. I am a native of Little Rock, Arkansas. I actually graduated from Philander Smith College with a bachelor's degree in chemistry and mathematics. I attended the College of Public Health at UAMS, and I have my Master of Public Health degree. I have been with DEQ for about 17 years. Currently, I am the Enforcement and Asbestos Branch Manager. Thank you.
So with no further ado, after seeing the faces behind this amazing information that y'all are going to learn, I will turn the microphone, with your indulgence, Mr. Chair, over to Will Montgomery for the State of the Air report. Thank you for your time.
Give us one moment while we get this set up.
Are you guys seeing presenter mode on this on the Zoom? Yeah, okay, let me fix that. I forget how to do that. Anybody better at PowerPoint setup than me? Because I can get it to show up. So I can get it to do from here, which fixes that, but it doesn't work for the Zoom.
What do you click share screen? PowerPoint slideshow.
Well, I don't want to share this slideshow because I want you to be able to get this to the
Okay, it's going to do this. That should work. Right?
Okay.
All right, there we go. Thank you. Cool. Sorry for that temporary delay. So every year we give the State of the Air report. And this year, like every other, we're going to be going over a little bit about our operations and a little bit about the air quality data and emissions we're seeing in Arkansas. So this report is available in addition to this PowerPoint I'm giving you. This is just going to be the highlights. We also have a PDF available online with more thorough information. I encourage you to take a look at that. And for the first time this year, we do have it available in something called a story map. It's like a self-guided PowerPoint. The benefit of that, it has some interactive graphics so you can explore certain types of the data in a little bit of a different way than normal. So you can get a better sense of what's going on, for example, in compliance and the locations of the different facilities around the state of Arkansas. So I know your time is valuable, so I'm going to be breezing through some of this, and then I'll hand it off to Tricia Trees to focus a little bit on the hard data for us. All right, let's see if we can begin this slideshow. So just to give you an overview, as I said, I'll introduce the Office of Air Quality generally and our functions, and then we'll talk about some of the accomplishments from FY 2020, which was of course partially impacted by COVID. So it's going to be a little bit of a unique year, but I think we did a good job handling that in the Office of Air Quality. And then I'll transition it over to Tricia when she talks about the policy and planning branch and subsequently the air quality data. So you just met some of our branch managers here. I think the only one you didn't meet was Heinz Braun. He's our compliance branch manager and reports to Tom Reum, but he's in the bottom left corner of this picture as well. We are divided into 4 constituent branches that kind of go up in our organizational structure. You know, the permits branch obviously writes the permits, compliance inspects the facilities to comply with the permits. And of course, the enforcement branch takes those referrals when there are areas of concerns and decides what to do at that point. We do have a small asbestos section in the Office of Air Quality. One part of the Clean Air Act does handle asbestos, but in addition to that, we have a robust licensing and certification program. So I'll mention that briefly. And of course, Tricia Treese's branch is policy and planning. So they house all the emissions inventory. Currently, they run the air quality monitors as well as analyze the air quality data. And then they have a number of other associated functions necessary for regulatory development and meeting other Clean Air Act requirements. So I won't go over this slide, but I do want to highlight that we do support local communities around the state in different ways, and that's not covered in the rest of the presentation. We have a couple of grants that we administer, particularly for the benefit of school districts and transportation agencies, where we provide funding to repower or replace certain qualifying heavy-duty diesel vehicles. We have a Go Red program, which is reducing emissions from diesels, the acronym for that one. And then we have a Clean Fuels program. And then during this fiscal year, we did administer a program called the State Agency Fleet Emission Reduction Act that provided funding to the Department of Transportation as well. So just as a refresher, the federal fiscal year does run from October 1st, 2019 to September 30th, 2020. So midway through, we were impacted by COVID. And I'll mention that briefly and how we overcame some of those challenges. So first, I'm going to talk about the permits branch. The story map does have this picture of the state on the right with all of our facilities, but it is interactive. So you can actually zoom in, click on the dot, figure out which facilities are located in your area. It does pull from our permitting data system, so you can get information like whether or not it's considered to be a major source or a minor source, that sort of a thing. There are four different primary permitting actions the permit branch handles. You know, registrations don't have any requirements. They're just required to be registered if you exceed certain thresholds, but you're below minor source thresholds. Once you exceed the minor source thresholds, you qualify for that permit, or you're required to get that permit. And then of course, there are higher thresholds for major source / Title V permits, which you can kind of use those interchangeably colloquially. I do also want to mention we have what's called a single permit system. We consider that to be a little bit more efficient. And I just want to mention that because in other states, there are things called pre-construction and operating permits. And here in Arkansas, those are together one permit. So you don't have to get one and then subsequently get the other. You just get one, what we call a Title V permit, and it has both of those requirements in one. So it's a little bit more efficient. So during FY 2020, we did have a number of general permitting actions. General permits are for categories of sources. Generally, when there are large numbers and there are similar or identical setups, you can permit them as categories. And you can see that we had a fairly large number of natural gas compressor stations as a result of the natural gas infrastructure around the state, not just in the shale, but also other unrelated natural gas infrastructure as well. And you can see some of the other ones. We had only had one crematory during this period, for example. So it does differ based on the category of sources and how many we have in a different year, in a given year. So just to go over FY 2020 minor source permitting actions, I would point out that the lighter color is the applications received and the darker color is issued, which is on the screen, but you will notice they don't line up exactly, and that's because some of the applications received would be issued in FY 2021, for example, so they're not going to line up one-to-one. Our average processing time for minor source actions was 140 days, which I'm particularly pleased with, and I'm very proud of our permitting team for turning around permits at that speed, because it was 14% faster than 2019. And of course, they were impacted by COVID, went remote fairly rapidly and had to adjust to changing conditions very well. I know many of us have children at home and other family obligations to juggle in the midst of that stressful time. So the fact that they were able to increase permitting times, I think, is a pretty laudable achievement for them. Similarly, for the major sources, we also were faster than 2019. That's 21% faster than in 2019. Our average processing time was 182 days. We do target 180 days for every permitting action for major source, so we're pretty close to our target, but not quite there yet. But I think we're on track to hopefully achieve that in the future. There are a number of different permitting actions that are different for minor sources, namely renewals. You reopen the permit and look at all conditions. So it's a little bit more of a heavy duty time consuming action, and there are fairly large quantities of those. So you can see that category on the right, and of course, relatively small numbers of new facilities getting major source permits in the state as well. So if you'll open the hard copy report or take a look at the PDF online, we do highlight certain activities with the tagline "Innovation at Work." And that's to kind of show how we overcame some of the challenges of COVID. These aren't necessarily new things, and you'll see many of these things are kind of echoed in offices around the country or maybe where you all work. But they did allow us to adapt relatively quickly. For example, we already have online permitting, and we saw an increase in that. So that's helpful for us because it increases our efficiency, not having to handle the paper, especially in the midst of COVID. But it also allows the facilities that submit hard copy and other options, so they weren't impacted in any meaningful way in the permitting process. We did launch one new program last year just before COVID started. So I do want to highlight that and let people know that it's still available if they're aware of any facilities that might be interested. That's our on-track assistance program. And that's where a facility can go online on ePortal and choose to have a meeting with both their inspector in their district and also the engineer that wrote their permit, and make sure everybody's on the same page about the obligations and conditions in the permit, how to interpret them, because we do see some things on the compliance side that we think can be hashed out and with a simple conversation, and we're hoping to encourage that. Moving along to the compliance branch specifically, in addition to performing regular unscheduled inspections, they also handle complaints from the public, which of course is particularly important during COVID because of the concerns about respiratory impacts of things like PM 2.5 from open burning, and other emissions as well, of course. They also go out and observe stack tests. That's when they do tests for the permits and basically make sure all emissions limits that they're required to test for can be adhered to. And then the compliance personnel, typically an inspector manager, goes out and makes sure those tests are being performed consistent with EPA methods. So in addition to that, we also, of course, they receive really large quantities of data in the form of semi-annual reports and annual compliance certifications. So compliance, I'm especially proud of compliance during this period because in addition to just being the face of the Office of Air Quality, like they are in all media in DEQ, it was, frankly, it was a little bit more risky during this period than normal to undertake their job duties. We felt like it was important to continue to remain in the field responding to citizen complaints because of the concerns of those impacts from things like open burning. So there was no disruption to responding to, for example, open burning complaints at any point during this time period. In addition to that, and I can tell you this is not true for every state around the country, they were able to go out and perform safe and socially distant inspections and meet all of our commitments to EPA. So we did inspect 101 Title V sources, and those can be very complex, and 572 minor sources. And of course, this team is less than 20, so that's a really large number of inspections. Especially considering the disruption that we underwent as we kind of pumped the brakes, reassessed how to perform inspections safely, and then went back out in the field. We did have procedures to, contact facilities in advance. We wouldn't tell them we were going to show up, but just kind of confirm the caseload was manageable, or we were able to perform the inspection in a socially distant manner if it wasn't outside, things like that. So we did put all necessary precautions in, but continue to serve the public in the way they expect, especially when everybody's concerned about respiratory symptoms. And then here's a little pie chart with the number of complaints investigated at this time as well. And you can see that we do have large numbers of open burning complaints. Relatively smaller proportion of odor, fugitive, and miscellaneous. So moving along to enforcement, after areas of concerns might be identified for a specific facility, those are referred over to enforcement. Enforcement typically takes one of two actions. They either consider it going informal if it's fairly minor, there are no health impacts, for example, maybe one or two violations, no environmental impacts either. we'll send a letter to them saying we're deferring further action until a later time, assuming these don't reoccur. The other alternative is to prepare a consent administrative order and send it to the facility to try and resolve these violations by agreement. And if that doesn't work, we'll proceed to what's called the notice of violation that would begin an administrative proceeding. So during FY 2020, you can kind of see the relative numbers here for asbestos and air, asbestos being a relatively small proportion of our overall inspections, and then of course, correspondingly fewer enforcement actions. I will note that the cases referred to enforcement, just kind of like some of the permitting numbers here, might be disposed of in FY 2021. So we might have received them in July or August, and then they would fall into the next fiscal year in November if we decided what to do with them at that point. This kind of gives you the sense of the numbers we're looking at. For asbestos, as I mentioned before, we do perform inspections, but we do also have a robust compliance and robust licensing program. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. You can kind of see the numbers here. We do issue licenses to both firms as well as individuals. Regulation 21 designates the ones for firms to be licenses and designates the ones for individuals to be certifications. So you can kind of see the numbers we're talking about with regard to the firms and roles that they license, as well as the different certifications for the individuals. I do want to highlight that there really are some very large numbers of workers, contractors, inspectors. So this is a pretty important licensing program. And then on the bottom, you can see air monitor. I do also want to mention that refers to generally a piece of equipment when you're talking about the Air Act generally, but when you're talking specifically about asbestos, that is an individual that goes out and is responsible for monitoring the air quality at an asbestos abatement site. And so during FY 2020, this kind of gives you a sense of the notices of intent. A structure that's subject to Regulation 21 is required to provide us with a notice of intent prior to demolition or renovation. So you can kind of see the breakdown. There are about equal numbers of demolitions and renovations going on in this time period around the state of Arkansas. And I would say a little bit that annual notices are really just a very small subset of facilities that are required to provide us annual notice if they undertake those. And I think the other items are pretty small overall numbers and self-explanatory. So with that, I'm going to hand this off to Tricia Treese in just a moment, but I do want to show you all the story map so you can get a sense of what that is. I think it's a really interesting way of presenting this information and hopefully very informative. So let's see if I can get Zoom to work here. Whoa. Screen share. State of the airport. Oh. Thank you, Tricia. So this is the state of the area story map. It's also abbreviated kind of like the PowerPoint, but you can see it's something self-guided. So you can provide it, for example, to, for educational purposes to schools or anyone that might be interested in the activities in the report. You can kind of see some of the same material I'm scrolling through. I just want to show you a couple of the interactive graphics so you can see what's available on there, specifically with regard to permits and compliance. So I believe there should be something that pops up here. Yeah. So you can see many of the same charts that I presented in the other presentation. But for example, this additional piece of interactive media is really cool. You can see that we have all of the facilities pulled out of our permitting database system. This is online, so I do believe it's fairly close to real time. This is recent data. And you can pick a facility, kind of see what information is there. I'll go down to where we are. We're pretty close to a couple of facilities I might show you just to illustrate the data that you can find. It's a little bit small for me down here, given that I'm nearsighted, but you can kind of see that it identifies the industry that it's in, whether or not it's major or minor source or registration, that sort of thing. And of course, the location. So if you're interested, you can kind of poke around and see what kind of facilities are located around the state in certain areas. You can kind of start to see clusters if you zoom out, and of course, you can kind of poke around. It's very interesting. So I do also want to scan forward here and show you another interactive graphic that provides a little bit different information than what you might get from my presentation or in the report, and that's for the compliance branch. So we do have interactive data with all of our kind of complaint responses, as well as inspection, stack testing observations here. And you can interact with it in a couple of different ways. You can either scroll through normally, and it'll actually show you which part of the state. It should center on the screen over the particular area. There we go. So for example, this is area office 2, and it has a breakdown of the number of complaints, stack test observations, annual compliance reports, that sort of a thing. And the other way to interact with, if you keep going, it'll just direct you over. And then the other way to interact with it is just to kind of zoom out, pick the area you're interested in, and then it'll bring it up and you can explore the data that way. So I just wanted to make you aware that that's available. I know Tricia has some data to present on this morning, so I'm available for questions afterwards, and I appreciate your time. Tricia?
All right, that was easier than setting it up the first time, so that's good. So I lead the policy and planning group, and we do a lot of things. So we have chemists who go out and maintain the monitors and collect the data. We've got various scientists who then take that data and compare it to national standards, look at what the requirements are for monitoring, and make sure that we have the correct monitoring in place. We also have our emissions inventory group who collects data from various permitted facilities. We put it into a database, submit it to EPA, and it's used for all kinds of things, especially air quality modeling, which we're really excited about. We have a wonderful air quality modeler running photochemical modeling, and that's a very complex process. So we're very excited about that capability. In addition to that, we have some technical writers and policy developers who take all that information that we're collecting and write state plans to preserve our clean air quality and to comply with federal law. And then we also offer some grants, or they're not grants. My grant coordinator would say, no, they're funding assistance programs, because we solicit projects, they complete the project, and then we reimburse them for completing a project. So these are mostly focused in the vehicle space, reducing diesel emissions. So we do a lot of school buses, transit buses, refuse trucks, and that sort of thing. So it's a way to help out the community, provide some assistance to get some newer equipment, but it's also cleaner equipment, so it also helps the air quality. So we have a meteorologist on staff, and he does air quality forecasting. And so this information is really important, especially between May 1st and September 30th. That's the ozone season. So these are times where we're more likely to have elevated ozone concentrations. And that's because it's warmer and the heat and the sunlight participate in that photochemical reaction. And so our meteorologist is looking at, okay, what's the air quality been at our monitors over the past couple of days, past few hours, and then what's going on, where's the air moving? Do we have a stable condition? Is it hot, or is there good mixing? And he takes all of that information and comes up with, okay, this is what I think the air quality is going to be like for this day. And so if we have days where we think ozone is going to be high, it might be unhealthy for sensitive populations, then we coordinate with local groups such as Metro Plan to get the message out to the public, hey, you might want to avoid being outside, during certain times today. We had a couple of those incidents earlier in June where we had to get that message out and try to engage with the public, let them know, hey, you might want to limit your time exercising outside just in case. So as I mentioned before, we're very excited to have a modeler. He's doing some photochemical modeling for us for our regional HAZE plan, showing how control strategies are resulting in visibility improvements at our Class 1 wilderness areas and national parks. He also assists the permits group with prevention of significant deterioration modeling. And so if you've got a very large facility coming in near a Class 1 area, you have to do modeling to show that that source isn't going to cause a negative impact. So I'm going to highlight some of the air quality trends. As I mentioned, the lab and our monitoring planning staff work in the policy and planning branch. We have monitors strategically located throughout the state, and these are based on federal requirements. So this is kind of an average of statewide design values. So when we're looking at monitoring data, we're not looking at what's going on at a monitor at a single point in time. We're looking at a time-weighted average, and then we're comparing that to a standard. So for all of the criteria pollutants, which are all the pollutants that we monitor to compare against the federal standards, we are below the federal standard, which is a good thing. That means our air quality is protective, including of sensitive populations. We are somewhat close to the value of the standards for our 8-hour ozone standard and for our annual fine particulate matter standard. And so I'm going to touch on those a little bit more, but all the rest of them were well below the standards. So for ozone, previous slide was a statewide average. This is what we actually are looking at when we're thinking about, is air quality safe in each given area of the state? And so you can see, we're kind of close to that standard. We're at what we would say is cautious, where we're really looking at it, making sure that we're being protective. Crittenden County has exceeded the ozone standard in the past for both the 2008 standard and the 97 standard. We are just below the current standard there. So we're keeping an eye on that, especially because a bad weather year could mean, that we get some bad values that potentially get us up there. So we're cautiously watching that. And this is just to show you what's happened over time. So we have reduced ozone throughout the state over the past decade. And again, Crittenden's running highest, but we've had reductions across the board. So the other one that I mentioned that we pay especially close attention to is fine particulate matter. And so we are, fairly well below the current annual standard throughout the state, although we're a little bit higher in Pulaski County. So we keep an eye on that. And again, those have been trending downward over time as well. So those are pollutants that we compare to our health-based standards. We also look at the impact of fine particulate matter on visibility conditions in federal Class 1 areas. So we have two in the state, Upper Buffalo and Caney Creek. So they're very beautiful mountain areas, and visibility is kind of important in those areas. And so we're working as part of the Regional HAZE program to restore visibility there to natural conditions. And so you can see that has also been trending down over time. And when I say trending down, reducing light extinction is good. That means we have less particulate in the air that's obstructing our views. We've got a similar story at Caney Creek. And one thing to point out here is when we're talking about fine particulate matter, there are various subspecies that compose that. And so one thing to note about this chart, and it was the same about the other one as well, is that the constituent of ammonium sulfate has been decreasing over time. And I'm going to hit on some of our emissions trends, and then I'll kind of show that same story.
What happened in 2005?
I don't know the specific event that happened in 2005. I'd have to go back.
I'm just curious what.
Okay. I would assume maybe we have some higher emissions that year, particularly of sulfur dioxide. And just to kind of give you what does that mean not in a bar graph? What does that mean visually? You can kind of see, you know, where we've come from. 2002 is the base year, or early 2000s is the baseline period for the regional haze program. And you can see on the most impaired days, we've come quite a long way between 2002 and 2019. We still got a ways to go to get back to natural conditions. So this lines up with those air quality trends. Let's talk about emission trends. So I'm going to kind of go over just the precursors for those pollutants that I talked about as we're paying more attention to. So volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxide are precursors for ozone. Nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxide are precursors, among other things, but they're the primary precursors for that particulate matter that's affecting our class 1 areas. And so for VOCs, those are volatile organic compounds, we are our trees cause a lot of VOCs in the air. And I know, but we love our trees. And we're not saying that's a bad thing. What we're saying here is because they make up the dominant amount of, you know, our VOC emission inventory, that maybe VOCs aren't the greatest control strategy to addressing ozone for Arkansas. So let's keep the trees. We love them, but let's remove them from our look at emissions. And you can see that from our biogenic emissions, we've been trending downward for those in both on-road as well as non-point, and point is fairly stable. So, all right, let's look at those NOx emissions, because we already know, all right, NOx is going to be a more effective control strategy for ozone in this state. And also, it's also one of those precursors that forms particulate matter. So we pay close attention to this. You can see that the biggest sources of nitrogen oxides in the state are on-road emissions, so cars, vehicles, and our point sources. So this is where we have a bit of a story to tell. You can see that both our point and on-road emissions for NOx have decreased over the years. And that's as we've implemented control strategies around NOx. For example, CSAPR, Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, or CASPR, the friendly plan, as we call it, is a trading program where power plants reduce their nitrogen oxide emissions. And that's fairly evident if you look at that darker blue, where we started reducing those. And then on road, we've had some more advanced corporate average fleet economy standards. And so those are reducing emissions from our mobile sector. So the other guy that affects particulate matter, or at least the other major constituent of our particulate matter, is SO2, so sulfur dioxide. And you can see the bulk of that is from point sources, and mostly that's from burning coal. And so you can see over time, we've actually had a dramatic reduction in sulfur dioxide from the point category. And that's as we've had some of our coal plants install retrofit controls, and some of them haven't been operating as much due to market conditions. So, and then looking at direct PM2.5, so we've got PM2.5, that's fine particulate matter, that's the stuff that gets deep in your lungs. We have those various precursors, but then it's also emitted directly. And so when we look at that, you'll see, okay, non-point sources, those are the area sources, not the ones that DEQ regulates. And then we have event sources, that's fires. So those two are what's dominating our direct PM2.5 inventory. And then you can see, as we look at that, non-point has increased a little bit there. And I will say that, you know, the particulate matter that's in the air, that is a combination of this direct particulate matter and all those ammonium nitrates, ammonium sulfates, and all those things that are related to your NOx and SO2 emissions. So lastly, I'm going to touch on some state plans. So the Policy and Planning Group is also responsible for writing Clean Air Act plans. So we have a couple of different kinds of plans. We have technology-based plans, which are called 111D plans. And we have visibility plans like regional haze. And then we have some infrastructure plans, which are basically how are we going to continue to maintain the national ambient air quality standards in the states. And so under development during FY 2020, we have the municipal solid waste landfills plan, and you'll hear more about that with the rulemaking that's coming up later on your agenda. That's related to that plan. We have our regional haze planning period 2 SIP, which is due in like a week. We're working hard on that. And then we have some various cleanup things. Anytime we change or have a statute that's part of the state implementation plan, or we have a rule that's part of the state implementation plan change, we have to go in and change what we've sent to EPA. We also had a good neighbor SIP that we sent out, basically saying, hey, sources in Arkansas aren't causing non-attainment problems, aren't causing air quality problems in other states for the ozone, and EPA hasn't acted on that yet. So we had a few plans approved. So we had the broad plan for how we're going to maintain the ozone standard in the state approved. We finally had the last piece of regional haze planning period 1 approved. That planning period ended in 2018, but it was finally acted on, and our progress report, and as well as the same kind of, this is how we're going to maintain the SO2 NAAQS was also approved. So, and that's it for me. So I think if you have any questions for Will and myself, we'll be happy to take those.
Any questions from the commission?
So can you describe how you count or don't count particulate matter, particularly from wildfire or prescribed fire?
How we count for it or don't count for it?
How in these standards or numbers, where would, and they're non-point sources, I suppose, how would we tout prescribed fire
Right.
every day?
Right.
And it's a wonderful tool to keep the fuels down so that we don't have catastrophic wildfire and for other ecological reasons. In any case, I'm interested in how we view in the numbers, in the standards, the amount of smoke that we necessarily put in the air or don't necessarily that are wildfires.
So if we have an extreme event that puts us at risk of exceeding one of the fine particulate matter standards, because that's the standard we'd be concerned about, typically, sometimes ozone, with prescribed fire or wildfire, we have the ability to submit an exceptional events demonstration that basically shows, but for this circumstance, we would be attaining the standard. And if we show that to EPA and they approve it, then we don't get some of the negative consequences associated with not meeting the standard and being designated non-attainment.
Thank you. Any other questions? Judge Moore.
Mr. Chairman, I normally don't ask questions, but my curiosity is piqued here a little bit. I've got a couple for you, Will. So the odor complaints that we get, has anything changed in terms of the agency's ability to regulate odor aside from hydrogen sulfide?
I mean, not recently. I mean, there haven't been any regulatory changes that affect that. We generally consider odor to be evidence of perhaps other emissions and investigate it as such. So we do send our inspectors out. If we link it to a facility, we'll try and work with the facility on it.
Does the complainants still get irritated with you when you tell them you don't have any authority over odor?
Well, I mean, sometimes the facilities do work with us anyway to install different controls to address it. Generally, they like to address these concerns. So it depends on the specific circumstances. Sometimes complainants don't like our responses in general, though.
And I apologize, I don't recall the numbers from the 2019 air report, but did the open burning complaints jump last year, or are they about the same level?
That's an interesting.
In other words, were more people open burning because there were more people home because of the pandemic, or?
That's a good question. I don't know it off the top of my head. Tricia, is that something that you've looked into?
We haven't looked into it, but we certainly have both those numbers and could get back with you on a comparison. Open burning is typically our largest complaint.
So I would say we just started tracking the number of open burning complaints just in the past year or two. So we should have data to compare year on year for that.
And since there seems to be such a preponderance of the complaints that you receive, how are you dealing with that from an enforcement or a regulatory perspective? Or is it just letter writing or instruction or?
It depends on the specific case of open burning. Some of it's agricultural burning, which is exempt, so we don't have regulatory authority over that. Some of it, if it's just somebody with a burn barrel burning things they shouldn't, we typically try and educate them. And if we can't educate them, then we will consider it an enforcement action, but that's a little bit more rare. A lot of people just simply aren't familiar with the requirements. Yeah.
Have any of them resulted in a consent decree off the top of your head from last year?
Not from last year.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Questions? Just a comment. Just looking at the NASA page, 2005 was in Sierra Desert Festival.
Okay.
Even back to the hurricane season. For your curiosity. Thank you.
So I have heard from our meteorologist, hopefully right now, there's another dust storm that may impact us, but right now it's not coming quite to us, but it's something we're keeping an eye on.
This would be a comment also, but 3-4 years ago, we had a ADQ-led smoke management workshop. You don't need to remember.
Mm-hmm.
That was very helpful to the forestry community and a lot of us. And it's probably time we do something like that again.
Well, that's a perfect setup, Commissioner, because we have just received funding from that same source, an EPA multi-purpose grant to host another workshop. So we're just beginning planning on that, and I'm sure you'll hear more from us. I'm glad you got a lot out of it a few years ago. We had actually hoped and actually planned on having one, but COVID hit, so it's been delayed.
He does. Okay, well, to the team of airheads, thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
For all your great work in the past year.
I need to stop sharing.
We'll move on to commission reports. First, a resolution for Becky White. Y'all know that typically when we have all these resolutions, we'll pass around to each commission to sign. There's certain typos in this one, so we're going to have the resolution done today. We'll wait till the next meeting before we all sign it. Resolution, whereas Becky White on the Arkansas Pollution Control and Ecology Commission ended April 30th, 2021. Whereas her actions in this official capacity as commissioner have helped to promote and secure a better environment for the state of Arkansas and its citizens. Therefore, be it resolved that the Arkansas Pollution Control and Ecology Commission hereby expresses sincere appreciation to Becky White for her service to the commission and wishes her well in all future endeavors. It's 23rd day of July, 2021. Judge Bolton, if you will now do us the pleasure of introducing our newest commissioner.
I'd be happy to, Mr. Chairman. I think former Commissioner White's resolution will segue quite nicely into Commissioner Osbrook's introduction. It's my understanding that Commissioner Osbrook has been with the Geologic Survey for 18 years, with the state of Arkansas for 20 years. I did not know this at all about his background, but he does have a lanyard around his neck with his badge on it that signifies he's got some nexus to the U.S. Marine Corps as well. And he may be able to explain that. Really, the only other thing I know about him specifically is that he is the state of Arkansas's earthquake expert, having headed up and been involved in the investigation of the various earthquakes and tremors that some folks thought were correlated to fracking. Some don't think they were, but he could probably explain that as well. Commissioner, welcome. So what's your Marine Corps background there, sir?
Yes, I served in Marine Corps from 1989 to 1995, including a Desert Shield and Desert Storm. I was a combat veteran, assigned to the 2nd Marine Division and 8th Marine, and we were tasked with part of the going into Kuwait City was our mission.
Did I get the rest of your background?
Yes, sir.
Correct, all right.
But thank you, and I look forward to working with everyone here in the commission and continue to serve the citizens of Arkansas.
Mr. Oswald, thank you for your service and welcome aboard.
Thank you, appreciate that very much.
Next up, we have Jennifer Merritt for the Arkansas Solid Waste Licensing.
Well, I'm not Jennifer Merritt, first of all. Jared Swipel, Associate Director of the Office of Land Resources on the environment side of things here. I'm here on behalf of the Solid Waste Licensing Committee to nominate a few members. With me. All right, here we go. Can you hear me now? Thank you. Again, my name is Jared Swipel. We've got a few members up for nomination and renomination. So before you today is a minute order for Mr. Jeff Barfield to fill the position vacated by Angela Sparks. And that is a new term. And then we also have a reappointment for a second term of Jody Reynolds Cofelt, Wendy Bland, and Randy Atkinson. And we also have a reappointment of Randy Harper. So there's a few reappointments and a nomination in a packet for you here for the Solid Waste Licensing Committee. And we've got some more information if you'd like to hear it, but I'd appreciate a positive vote on these individuals for the Solid Waste Licensing Committee.
Thank you, Jared. Any questions from the commission?
Chair, I move adoption of the minute order. Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you. Okay, on to Rule 19. I guess Mr. McCallum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Michael McAllister for the department. We are here to initiate Rule 19, and because that's an air rule and we have the very able and capable air team here, I'm going to ask Mr. Montgomery to present the basics of this rulemaking to you.
Well, hello again. So this time I'll be presenting the petition to initiate rulemaking on Rule 19. Broadly speaking, this is a cleanup rulemaking, so it makes a number of substantive and non-substantive changes, but we just consider them to be cleanup. There's some stylistic changes, some technical changes to require the latest version of Appendix W, which is EPA's guideline on air quality models, because we don't want to require different versions in EPA. We are repealing provisions for the control of volatile organic compounds in Pulaski County. That was put into place when Pulaski County was in non-attainment for ozone, and that was more than 20 years ago, and they've since become outdated. You know, Pulaski County is currently in attainment for ozone, and if it went in non-attainment, we would have to put in place entirely separate regulations. Now, as Tricia referenced earlier, there's been some new research that indicated that we're actually what's called NOx limited. That means the primary factor determining whether or not the chemical reaction that produces ozone is the amount of nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere and not the amount of volatile organic compounds. And that's, as Tricia referenced, because of the amount of trees we have. Large chunks of the country have the same conditions as well. So they're no longer ineffective, they're outdated. And if we went into non-attainment, we'd have to repeal them and replace them anyway. So we're gonna go ahead and take care of that now in this rulemaking. We're also proposing to repeal the Clean Air Interstate Rule, because that was replaced by the cross-state air pollution rule, which Tricia referred to as CASPER, the Friendly Trading Program. And then we're also proposing certain requirements for existing municipal solid waste landfills. Those regulations are identical to existing federal requirements. After adoption, we will include them in a state plan and submit them to EPA, and that will allow us to assume primary implementing authority for those regulations. In addition, both the federal plan and the state plan will not result in any financial burden on the municipal solid waste landfills because none of them are large enough to trigger the requirements to install gas collection and control systems. They could potentially in the future, but currently we don't anticipate any impact from that. So with that, I guess I should also mention that we don't anticipate any negative financial impact. We're bringing certain testing requirements in line with federal requirements, which should have some financial benefit to certain craft pulp mills. And then of course, there is probably going to be some financial benefit to rescinding the volatile organic compounds requirements for Pulaski County that are not effective anymore, or that were never effective. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on the specifics. That was by no means comprehensive, but I wanted to give you an overview of some of the more substantive changes we're proposing.
I missed the pulp mill thing.
That's right. Yeah, so we are making a change to bring craft pulp mill testing requirements in line with federal requirements. So the federal requirements are that they test every 5 years. Currently, we require them to test every year for, I think it's total reduced sulfur. So they're going to be consistent with federal requirements from that one. Yeah. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Do we have a motion?
Motion.
Legal, seconds. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Judge Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a recommended decision for the Commission's consideration in the matter of Little Rock Water Reclamation Authority. I think the recommendation speaks for itself, but I'd be happy to answer any questions. And if you have questions for council, Mr. Spencer's gone, but Ms. Ewing is still here. Mr. Wick, I don't remember you being at. So those of you that remember Jordan, he had a full like ZZ Top beard at one point in time. For years he's had that, and he just recently shaved it off. Any questions from the commission on this recommendation? If not, I would request a favorable vote.
So no. Any questions? No questions? We have a motion. Approved. Mills, we have a second. Second. Fox, thank you. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, motion carries. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I've got one other matter for the commission before we get into the nominations committee report. I would like to report to the commission that the retreat that you all wanted to do in the fall, we have scheduled for the afternoon of October 21st, which is the Thursday before our October meeting, a visit to the Remington facility in Lone Oak, Arkansas. It's about a 3-hour tour. And after the tour is over, I was told that anyone that wants to test their product may do so on their range. So I will be soliciting input from the commission in terms of how many of you are going to be going. The only caveat that I have from the folks that are setting up the meeting for us is that they typically like to do it in groups of 5, so we won't be able to all do it together. But that's kind of similar to the way we did our Skippy tour. If you recall, we kind of had to break ourselves up then. Any questions about that? Oh, and let me add one other thing. I have to give a nod to the chair because I was up against a brick wall trying to get Remington to respond to me or return my phone calls. But Commissioner Goggins had a contact, and I was able to use that contact to facilitate this tour. All right, folks, thank you.
Thank you, Judge. Okay, moving on, the nominations committee met prior to the commission meeting and have nominations for chair, Commissioner Roper, and for vice chair, Commissioner Vanderbilt. Do we have a motion on that? Thank you. Have a second? Second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Very good. That will do it for this month. Thank you all. This meeting is adjourned.
Mr. Chairman, too, let's wait for those minute orders to circulate, and I believe we're gonna have lunch for those that want to have it in the regular spot after the meeting's over.